I'm live, ho. The last chapter was so fascinating. I'm only working this afternoon, so I thought I will read another little bit, the beginning of part 4. I know that her life was fascinating, and this is, well, it surely isn't her whole life, because there's only a few more chapters of chapter 4, and I know she had an extensive life until 1989. I'm talking about Joan Grant. She is a far memory writer. She lived from 1907 till 1989, and in this book she explains the process of why she was able to write these amazing books. Winged Pharaoh being one of the most famous, and Life as Kabbalah and so on. And she had a vision in this last chapter which was quite extraordinary. We're now in chapter 1 of part 4 of this book, Preparations for a Journey. On a July evening in 1934, Leslie returned from a cocktail party and announced that he was going to be an archaeologist instead of a barrister. He was still rather vague about the details. A man called Seton Lloyd had given him a job as the photographer on one of the Oriental Institute of Chicago University digs. The site, Tel Azmar, was about 70 miles from Baghdad. They paid return fare and keep. My fare and Gillian's too, I said hopefully. No, of course not. It wouldn't be suitable for a child in any case, and I forgot to ask about wives. I'll find out more from the form tomorrow when I meet Hans Frankfurt, the director. I don't suppose he'd mind me if he's prepared to take an archaeologist photographer who doesn't show anything about archaeology, who doesn't know anything about archaeology and not much about photography. No need to tell them that, he said hastily. I can easily learn. We're not going until September. I'm sure I could help. There are women on the dig, so perhaps I can fix it for you to come too. You could catalogue the finds, or even do some of my routine work once I taught you the knack of it. I shall be far more useful than that. How? I can tell you where to dig. Just give me a chip of whatever you found, and then I'll psychometrize it and tell you where it joins on to the next bit. Much better than scrabbling vaguely about it in the sand. No, he sounded anguished. Archaeology is a science. And I'm a better scientist than you are, I said hotly. No one could be more scientific than Father. All those thousands of hydrogen ion concentrations I've done, all that peering through microscopes, all those card indexes. But when he left England after 6 weeks of intense concentration in a photographer's studio, he still hadn't found out whether there was a chance that I could see him before the spring. He suggested that I let 107 Beaufort Street for 6 months and go to Sequard, but I replied that although I might be considered luggage not wanted on voyage, I was not going to be put into storage. I tried to make myself believe that I was going to enjoy being a grass widow, but when I saw the train sliding out of Victoria Station, he was going to Marseille and then by boat to Beirut, I felt far more like an anxious mama seeing her son off to his prep school. Had I packed enough shirts, enough pants, enough socks? Would anyone look after him if he's got pneumonia again? And how would he manage with a simple cold when he always refused to let anyone except me see him, or even carry a tray into the room when he was under the weather? Hilary had arranged a girls' luncheon at Premier's to cheer me up. And when I despondently returned to the subject of what poor Leslie would do when there were holes in all of his 24 pairs of new socks, one of them reminded me that unless female archaeologists were far more archaeologists than female Leslie's socks, darner would always get done. That's an interesting sentence. Okay, I'll start it again. Hilary had arranged a girls' luncheon at Premier's to cheer me up, and when I despondently returned to the subject of what poor Leslie would do when there were holes in all his 24 pairs of new socks, one of them reminded me that unless female archaeologists were far more archaeologists than female Leslie's socks would always get darned. In the middle of October, he wrote to say that I was to join him at the beginning of January, and the same day I booked a place on the airplane that would leave on New Year's Day. He loathed writing letter and had warned me not to expect any unless there was essential information, so my news of him was limited to such items as bring only thin clothes, it's damnly hot, or all your evening dresses and more soft collars for me, which indicated that Americans in the desert, like the British in the jungle, always changed for dinner. A postcard of an Arab horse to Gillian read, I ride on a horse rather like this. Tell Mummy I'll give her a horse for Christmas so she can ride too. This was enchanting news, for experience had done little to destroy my conviction that only lack of practice and opportunity to get on really cosy terms with my steed prevented me echoing on earth the magnificent gallop which I enjoyed in the less muscle-bound realms. I toyed with the idea of going down to Crabbett Park and asking Judith Wentworth whether she could give me any inside information as to how to get friendly with Arab horses, of which she knew more than anyone in England. But I thought better of this, for after she had taken me into the tennis court and won at least 4 sets out of 5, I would be too exhausted even to cajole a Margaret Sands donkey. Reginald Leslie, a friend of ours who claimed to know as much about horses as he did about flying airplanes, tried to damp my enthusiasm by saying that Leslie was bound to be cheated by a Bedouin horse-coper, who would never dream of selling an animal which was not either to be so broken-winded that it would fall down when I mounted, or else so full of vice that no one else would be fool enough to get on its back. I defended Leslie's judgment with some heat and pointed out that I had told him exactly what kind of animal to buy for me. It was to be a mare, for females are more intuitive than males, and I would need all the intuition I could get if I was to talk horse effectively, especially in Arabic. It was to be young, so that its natural good nature would not have become soured and suspicious. Its colour was not important, but I should prefer a sandy apricot with a white mane and tail. At this, Reginald groaned aloud and, casting his eyes to heaven, called on the gods, who protect drunks, fools, and horsemen, to witness that he had done his best to warn me. The most I can do for you, my poor deluded child, he said mournfully, is to organize your riding clothes so that you die with the right kind of boots on. Every item had to pass his critical eye, and my views were ignored, as though I was a schoolgirl being outfitted by a stern governess for her first term at Bordeaux. The boots, with very heavy and expensive boxwood trees, with my name inscribed on a little ivory plate, were constructed by Peel. Izod made my shirts with collars so tight they nearly choked me. Buzzwine made my hacking jacket and joppers. After I learned discussion between Reginald and the cater as to whether I should have fly buttons or a barn door front, they decided on the barn door, ignoring my comment that it seemed ostentatious to have a stable without a horse to put in it. I fancied myself in breeches, but there was a slight undertone of being fitted for a shroud, so I tried to learn to be worthy of my outfit by exercise on hirelings in Hyde Park. This did nothing to increase my confidence, for one of the patient animals took fright at the sight of a carriage and pair while crossing the bridge over the Serpentine, and tottered backwards on its hind legs until it found itself sitting on the balustrade while I hung onto its mane to stop myself falling some 30 feet into the lake. Another, which looked even more deceptively solid and careworn, broke into a gallop at the end of Rotten Row and carried me out of the gates and halfway up Hark Lane among hooting omnibuses before it skidded to a full stop with its legs sprawled out on the corners as though it was trying to peg its hooves into the tarmac. I took Julian to Seacourt for Christmas so she would feel settled there before I had to leave. I gave her a pony called Ruby, a Shetland with a nature amiable as a dog's, who trotted round the garden and stopped by the root store and the fruit house for snacks of apples and carrots. She had ridden since she was 3 and was much better at it than I ever was. It was not until years later she admitted that she had always loathed horses and only pretended to like them so as not to disappoint me. On Boxing Day we both developed flu, which postponed my departure by a fortnight. On my way back to London I tried to stop myself looking backwards at the misery of leaving Gillian instead of looking forward to being with Leslie. But I was only partially successful, for I have never been able to teach myself not to want all my eggs in one basket. Packing is a good care for the dreeps, especially when a very reasonable amount of things fills such a surprising number of suitcases. I had 15 by the end of it all, although 4 of them were filled with photographic equipment and drawing papers, books, tins of tobacco and grandmother's records, which had been sent to me to take out to various members of the expedition. The morning before I left, I got another of Leslie's airmail letters. Don't try to smuggle anything through the customs. Declare everything. We'll meet you with money to pay duty, which will be about £200. Bring a case of kippers, 50 fire balloons, and a gross of French letters, having promised some to the RAF. Much love. French letters. Much love, Leslie. For a moment I tried to believe that the last 3 instructions were meant as a joke. Then I telephoned Fortnum and Mason and asked how long a case of skippers would keep in an airplane. A soothing voice replied that it would depend on whether I was travelling to the equator or to the North Pole, and on hearing that I was only going to Baghdad, promised to send them round immediately. I telephoned to Father and asked, what are 5 fire balloons and where do I get them? He said as far as he knew the last one had been made by Montgolfier about 1794, and said that more recent astronauts considered them impractical. Selfridge's Inquiry Bureau was not much more informative, but they told me to try Gammers, who after some research discovered that they had 4 dozen of the things, which were sometimes used by surveyors to test wind drift, and they would send them around in a taxi, which was a load off my mind as I had visualized large machines of canvas instead of light and easily packable spheres of coloured paper, which is what they turned out to be. The purchase of the last item I landed on to Stan via Diana, and in spite of his protests, she bullied him into it. This was one thing I was not going to declare, but suppose they were discovered? How many customs barriers would I have to pass? Or should I register luggage to its destination? Never having been in an aeroplane except once in Reginald Moth's, I rang up Imperial Airways. Luggage was liable to be opened in transit on entering France, Italy, and Egypt. The Italian customs were particularly rapacious, since Mussolini had forbidden British planes to fly over Italy, so making it necessary for Imperial Airways passengers to make that part of the journey by train. Well, there was nothing I could do about it. So I went to bed and had a worry dream in which my old enemy, the customs man at the French-Italian border, enraged and in pyjamas, was finding exactly what I did not want him to find in front of a jeering crowd of fascisti. Chapter 2. How many miles to Babylon? Daisy took me to Croydon Airport and gave me a flask filled with old liqueur brandy. Just in case you feel airsick. I believe that aeroplanes are much less stable than balloons. Outwardly serene, she watched me pass beyond the passenger-only barrier and then walked briskly away towards her waiting car. The officials seemed startled by my quantity of luggage. They charged me excess fare, which was less than I feared from rather vague weighing on baby scales, which only went up to £20, and said severely that although this plane was not loaded to capacity, and I could therefore take it all with me as far as Paris, I must not expect to be so fortunate on later stages of the journey. And I must fully understand that most of it would probably be left behind en route to follow when practicable. Although large by the standards of over 20 years ago, the airplane looked as though it were made of tin foil. It shuddered so violently when the engines revved up that I began to think I was not only destined to be born but also to die near Croydon. Then, as though a Pegasus was flying through a vast hoop of grey paper, it escaped from the confines of grey rain into a world of brilliant sunshine and high blue sky. The steward brought me a cup of coffee, which did not even slop into its saucer. Thank God I liked flying. No one could feel sick in an airplane. What a relief. After 4 hours in Paris and lunch at Voisines with a fellow passenger, we caught the Rome Express with 5 minutes to spare. Luggage of air passengers could not be put in the van, nor was there an empty compartment in the wagon lil to accommodate it. But eventually 2 sweating porters stacked it in my sleeper, leaving only the bed free, which I could reach in the manner of chamois leaping to its sleeping niche. The Italian customs passed without incident. Perhaps they thought that no really efficient smuggler would try to take so much at one time, and I settled down to write my first letter to Gillian so that I could post it in Rome. She was still young enough to prefer her stories illustrated, so as I draw no better than the average 4-year-old child, I invented 2 characters called Regga and Muffin. Regga was easily identified by his striped suit and horn-rimmed glasses, and Muffin was a gollywog with curly hair. They were to share all my adventures as the hero and heroine of a twice-weekly serial which ran for the next 4 months. In the first installment, they visited Elba, which I claimed quite untruly to be looking at from the train window, and I lunched with Napoleon, easily recognizable by his hat and his arm tucked into his waistcoat. Then they crossed the Alps with Hannibal, clinging to the trails of 2 of his elephants, which they had tamed by feeding bananas to them from a paper bag. Elephants, especially when proceeding in the opposite direction, are easy to draw, and anyone can manage mountains and fir trees. On the second night in the train, I returned to my sleeper at midnight, having sat until then in the dining car listening to the broken romance of an elderly cloth manufacturer from Manchester, whose prospective bride on the eve of the wedding had bolted with a red-headed tea taster. The only consolation I could offer, which seemed to cheer him disproportionately, was that as he had brought a magnificent bedroom suite, he would there henceforth sleep on a super deluxe V-spring mattress in a double bed, more comfortable, although alone, than he had ever done in his life. I woke before dawn, nearly frozen solid, as I had left the window wide open and forgotten that we had another range of mountains to cross, from which snow had blown in to make it drift across my feet. Brindisi in the cheerless winter dawn was even colder, and the sea so rough that the launch that took us out to the flying boat had to make several attempts before it at last got near enough for us to scramble on board. The mountains of Albania, seen across the dark blue Adriatic, were supremely beautiful, but then the weather began to close in. I was sharing a seat with a man who had recently competed in the Schneider Trophy air race, and while in happy ignorance, I was thinking how clever it was of our pilot to fly up mountain valleys, so narrow that it seemed we were going to brush snow off the precipices with our wingtips. I heard him muttering, "The silly bastards will never make it. We're going to touch, oh Jesus." And I was at once more convinced that Mount Olympus is much better seen from a long distance rather than horizontally, as a range of a few hundred yards. We landed at Piraeus to refuel, and there was talk of spending the night in Athens. But the weather report, quite inaccurately as it turned out, said we should run into better weather before we got to Crete. The literature provided for the entertainment of passengers informed me that I was now flying over the Greek islands, probably the finest scenery on the whole of our air routes. But we were encased in clouds thicker than any London fog, and for the first time in my life I thoroughly disliked a thunderstorm. Lightning, like bolts in the hands of Zeus, tore through the blackness. The flimsy flyboat swayed, lurched, fell heavy as a stone into nightmare pits and staggered out of them. The heating was out of order. Someone had forgotten to put air sickness bags on board. People were sick into newspapers on or onto the floor. A charming old gentleman in the seat facing me looked wildly around and with a gesture of apology vomited so neatly into the pocket of his navy blue overcoat that I offered him the remains of my brandy. When the steward inquired whether any passengers would be requiring lunch, everyone glared at him, except an elderly couple. He was a retired Major General from Dorset, who, with his equally elderly wife, was going to visit their granddaughter in Khartoum. They swallowed every morsel of their lunch with apparent enjoyment, chatting to each other between mouthfuls, as though they were eating crumpets under a cedar on the edge of their croquet lawn. My Schneider trophy friend lurched down the aisle and disappeared into the pilot's compartment. When he returned, he looked even more worried. "We can't land on Crete. Visibility is down to 0, he confided to me. Don't mention it to the others. No point in them getting the vertical wind up. The weather grew worse, the only advantage being that I was now too frightened to feel sick. At intervals, my companions went to consult the pilot and always returned with an increased conviction that we were in the hands of an over-optimistic lunatic who should have turned back to Greece while he had the chance, and now would almost certainly run out of fuel before we reached Alexandria. One of the engines coughed, spluttered, and then died. The flying boat went into a long glide. Suddenly, streams of cloud were wisping past the window. The port engine cut out until we were bouncing on the water of Alexandria harbour. We reached the hotel at 9:30, and the hairdresser, with whom I had booked an appointment 3 months before and long since forgotten all about it, had kept his shop open for me. It was far too tired to care whether I arrived in Baghdad with train dust in my hair or not, but I could not disappoint the kindly barber, and nearly allowed him to dye my hair red, which he suggested would be a nice surprise for my husband. I ordered dinner in my room, and it was brought while I was having a bath in the adjoining bathroom, which had a glass-panelled door. I was called out at 4:30 a.m. after an almost sleepless night, as the storm ceaselessly rattled the French windows and had stones threatened to batter in the ill-fitting glass. It was still dark, but in the light from the passage I recognized the Arab waiter as the same man who had collected my dinner tray the night before. He told me that the weather was too bad to fly and that I would have to stay in the hotel until the next plane left on Friday. I was on the point of thankfully going back to sleep when I suddenly felt suspicious. Why on Friday? Why not tomorrow or later today, if the weather improves it? He began to stammer in French. The Mem Sahib must not fly. It would be a tragedy if a lady so charming as she, whom he had watched having her bath, should be killed. He would wait on me devotedly, do more than kiss my hand unless I permitted. I sat bolt upright in bed, clutching the eiderdown to my rather meagre breast. So this was one of the licentious foreigners of whom mother had so often warned me. "Allez, Cousin," I shouted. "Vite!" It is difficult to be commanding in those circumstances, but at last he began to sob, implored me not to tell the manager, and admitted that although all except 3 of the other patients had decided to wait for better weather, the plane was going. In fact, the bus was leaving in 10 minutes for the airport. Might have left already, but I caught it by running after it halfway down the street. Gaza was sunny and warm, and we had tangerines with the leaves still on, and eggs and bacon for breakfast. The other passengers were 2 silent soldiers who were on their way to India to shoot tiger with the Maharaja, and the Schneider trophy pilot who was suffering acutely from a hangover. Apart from a dust storm which penetrated into the cabin and undid all the good that had been done to my hair the night before, the flight was uneventful and 2 hours shorter than scheduled because of a strong tailwind. The airport 5 miles outside Baghdad was a flat bit of brown nothing, surrounded by miles and miles of exactly the same. The only building was a corrugated iron shed. But where was Leslie? The other 3 were met by friends and drove away in a cloud of dust. I sat on my largest suitcase and waited. The officials, none of whom spoke any English or any French either, hung about smoking cigarettes. 3 of them at last shrugged their shoulders and drove away in the larger of the 2 buttered trucks. The 2 remaining men offered me glasses of mint tea which I thankfully accepted as a goodwill offering. It is difficult to explain entirely in mime that one's husband is apt to be unpunctual, but will certainly arrive soon with money to pay the customs duty. At last their patience began to wear thin, or perhaps they had wives less patient than I was being. They pointed to their watches, rubbed their stomach to show they were already late for dinner, rattled the key in the door of the customs shed to show it was closing time. I began to unlock suitcases. At least no one should accuse me of being a smuggler as well as being abandoned in Baghdad. They beamed, put a finger to mount for silence. It was to be understood that I had nothing to declare. Trying to work out the duty would waste even more of their time. Slow to take the hint, I waved rolls of film, tins of tobacco, gramophone records at them. They frowned. Could my female be quite so obtuse? Could any female be quite so obtuse? They waved me aside. They locked my bags. They scored chalk marks all over them. Then they slung everything into the remaining track, lifted me into it, rattled across the desert at the maximum speed the ancient vehicle could urge out of its panting cylinders, and deposited me outside the Maud Hotel. The obvious question is, why did I not hire a car and go to Tel Asmar? But I had no idea in which direction it lay, and the only address I had was P.O. Box 64, Baghdad, from which letters were collected twice a week. The hall porter spoke a little French, but was not very helpful. The archaeologists usually met in the bar of a small hotel further down the street towards the souk. He thought that he had seen one of the expedition's cars that afternoon. He would keep my luggage if I wished to look for my husband. I went into the first bar, the second, the third. Unfortunately, in those days I disliked alcohol and was sustained only by glasses of over-sweetened lemonade. I found in my bag a piece of pink chalk, which I must have absent-mindedly stolen from one of the customs men. On each bar, after lavishly tipping the barman, I drew a large Joan and an arrow indicating the direction of my progress. In the fifth bar, Leslie caught up with me. He had missed me by 10 minutes at the airport, where he had arrived late only because the gale, which he thought would delay the plane by at least an hour, had most unfairly been blowing in the opposite direction a few thousand feet higher up. He had been hot on my trail ever since, and was happy to find me, as I was to be found. That was lovely. Next one is entitled Fantasy and Fact.